The summer of 1952 was unusually hot in Connecticut. The kind of heat that made wealthy families throw open every window in their mansions and pray for a breeze that never came. At the Thornwood estate, preparations for the garden party had been going on since dawn. Margaret Chen moved through the grand hallroom like a shadow. Her hands worked steadily, dusting the enormous piano that sat near the French doors. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway grand that probably cost more than she'd earn in 10 years. She ran her cloth gently over the polished black surface, careful not to leave a single streak. The piano had been sitting here for 3 years now, ever since old Mr. Thornwood passed away. He used to play sometimes, simple melodies that drifted through the house on quiet evenings. But after he died, the piano mostly stayed silent. The family kept it because it looked impressive. Important guests always commented on it. Margaret stepped back to examine her work. Perfect. Not a speck of dust anywhere. She could see her reflection in the glossy surface, distorted and small. That's how she felt most days. Small. Invisible. Just another part of the furniture. Margaret, where are those serving trays? Mrs. Thornwood's voice echoed from the kitchen, sharp and impatient, as always. Coming, ma'am, Margaret called back, giving the piano one last look before hurrying away. By 3 o'clock, the garden was full of people. Women in expensive dresses that probably cost a month of Margaret's salary. Men in light suits, smoking cigars, and laughing too loud. The younger crowd had started drifting inside to escape the heat, and that's when things got interesting. James Thornwood had arrived home from Yale 2 weeks ago, and he'd been insufferable ever since. At 24, he carried himself like he owned the world. Maybe he did, in a way. Money, looks, education, connections. Everything had always come easy to him. He sat down at the piano now, his jacket tossed carelessly over a chair. His fingers moved across the keys, playing something jazzy and upbeat. Not particularly good, but not terrible either. The kind of playing that comes from expensive lessons you never really wanted. A small crowd gathered around him. Friends from college, society girls hoping to catch his attention, older couples who'd known him since he was a boy. James, you've gotten better, one of the women said, though everyone knew it was a lie. He'd gotten worse, actually. Too many late nights, and too much drinking at school. Oh, this old thing practically plays itself, James said, grinning. He hit a wrong note, and laughed it off. Besides, I'm sure anyone could do it. It's not exactly difficult. His younger sister Elizabeth sat nearby, quieter than the rest. She was 19, home from her first year at Smith College. Unlike her brother, she actually noticed the people who worked in their home. She'd had conversations with Margaret, real ones, about books and weather, and small things that made life bearable. Not everyone, James, Elizabeth said softly. It takes practice. Practice. James laughed, spinning around on the piano bench. My dear sister, you sound like Mother. Next, you'll tell me it builds character. He played a dramatic flourish, showing off. I bet even our help could play, if they tried. It's just pressing keys. Really. The room went quiet for a moment. That uncomfortable kind of quiet when someone says something that crosses a line, but no one wants to be the first to call it out. Margaret appeared in the doorway just then, carrying a silver tray with fresh glasses. She'd learned to time her entrances and exits, to slip in and out, without disturbing the family and their guests. But James spotted her immediately. Margaret. Perfect timing. He stood up, gesturing grandly. Come here. We were just talking about you. She froze. Nothing good ever came from being singled out like this. But she couldn't refuse. Not in front of all these people. She walked forward slowly, holding the tray steady. I was just telling everyone how easy the piano is, James continued, his voice carrying that particular tone rich people use when they think they're being clever. In fact, I'll make you a deal. You play that piano, and I'll marry you. How's that for an offer? The room erupted in laughter. Not the kind that comes from real joy, but the nervous, cruel kind that people use to cover their discomfort. Someone whistled. A woman gasped and giggled behind her hand. Margaret stood there, the tray growing heavy in her hands. She looked at James, really looked at him. His smug smile, his easy confidence, the way he lounged against the piano like it was nothing more than furniture. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Not anger exactly, though there was some of that. Not embarrassment either. It was something deeper. Something that looked almost like recognition, like she was seeing something in that moment that no one else could see. Well, James prompted, spreading his arms. Don't be shy. Give us a performance. The other guests were watching now, waiting to see what would happen. This was entertainment to them. A little drama, to break up the boring afternoon. Margaret set down the tray carefully on a side table. The glasses clinked softly against each other. She looked at the piano, then back at James. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but steady. No, thank you, Mr. Thornwood. That was all. 4 words, polite and final. Then she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps barely making a sound on the expensive carpet. The laughter died away awkwardly. James looked around, suddenly unsure if he'd won or lost whatever game he thought he was playing. Well, that's that then, he said, trying to recover. But Elizabeth was watching the doorway where Margaret had disappeared. She felt sick to her stomach, though she couldn't quite say why. There was something about the way Margaret had looked at that piano, something about the careful way she'd set down the tray before walking away. The party continued, but the mood had shifted somehow. People drifted back outside to the garden. James played a few more songs, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He kept glancing at the doorway, feeling strangely bothered by the whole thing. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the house was being cleaned up, Elizabeth found Margaret in the kitchen. She was washing crystal glasses by hand, even though they had people who did that. I'm sorry about my brother, Elizabeth said quietly. He can be thoughtless. Margaret didn't look up from the sink. It's fine, Miss Elizabeth. I'm used to it. But her hands, Elizabeth noticed, were gripping the glass she was washing just a little too tightly. Her knuckles were white, and there was something in her eyes. Some distant look, like she was somewhere else entirely. He shouldn't have said that. Elizabeth pressed. About the piano. Finally, Margaret looked at her. Really looked at her. And for just a second, Elizabeth saw something in those eyes that took her breath away. Not sadness, not anger. Something fiercer. Something that looked like a secret being kept at tremendous cost. Your brother doesn't know anything about pianos, Margaret said softly. Then she went back to her washing, and the moment was gone. Elizabeth left the kitchen feeling like she'd just witnessed something important, though she couldn't explain what. Outside, the summer night was finally cooling down, but inside the Thornwood estate, something had shifted. Something had been set in motion that no one quite understood yet. The piano sat in the ballroom, silent and waiting. And in the kitchen, Margaret Chen finished the last glass and dried her hands, her expression carefully blank. But inside her chest, her heart was beating fast, remembering things she'd worked so hard to forget. 3 nights after the garden party, Elizabeth woke up to music. At first, she thought she was dreaming. The sound was distant, muffled by walls and hallways, but unmistakable. Piano music, flowing through the dark house like water. Not the simple melodies her grandfather used to play, not the clumsy jazz her brother attempted. This was something else entirely. She sat up in bed, listening. The music was complex, powerful. It rose and fell with a kind of emotion that made her chest tight. Whoever was playing knew exactly what they were doing. Elizabeth slipped out of bed and pulled on her robe. The house was dark, except for the moonlight streaming through the tall windows. She moved quietly down the hallway, following the sound. Her bare feet made no noise on the wooden floors. The music was coming from the ballroom. As she got closer, she recognized the piece. Chopin, maybe? She'd heard it at a concert once in New York. Her mother had dragged the family there, and James had complained the whole time. But Elizabeth had loved it. She stopped at the doorway, staying in the shadows. And there, at the piano, sat Margaret. The caretaker's back was straight. Her head tilted slightly as her hands moved across the keys. In the moonlight, she looked different. Not smaller or invisible anymore. She looked like she belonged there, like the piano had been waiting for her all along. Elizabeth held her breath. She'd never seen anyone play like this. Not even the professional pianist at that New York concert. Margaret's fingers moved with impossible grace, pulling sounds from the instrument that seemed almost alive. The music swelled and quieted, full of longing and pain, and something that felt like memory. The piece ended. Margaret's hands hovered over the keys for a moment, then fell to her lap. She sat there in the silence, her shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Elizabeth didn't know what to do. Should she leave? Say something? Before she could decide, Margaret spoke without turning around. "You can come in, Miss Elizabeth." Elizabeth jumped slightly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to spy. I just heard the music and it's all right." Margaret turned on the bench, her face calm in the dim light. "I should have been more careful. Usually, I wait until everyone's asleep. You play every night?" Elizabeth walked into the room, drawn forward, despite her uncertainty. "Most nights, when the house is quiet." Margaret looked at the piano, running one hand along its edge. "It's the only time I can." Elizabeth sat down in one of the chairs near the French doors. Outside, the garden was silver with moonlight. "Why didn't you say something? When James made that awful joke, you could have just played something. Shown him." Margaret smiled, but it was a sad kind of smile. "And what would that have accomplished? Your brother would have been embarrassed. Your mother would have been angry that I'd made a scene. I would have lost my position. But you're so talented. That's not fair." "Fair?" Margaret repeated the word like it was foreign. "Miss Elizabeth, I've learned that fairness is something people talk about when they have choices. I don't have many choices." Elizabeth wanted to argue, but something in Margaret's voice stopped her. There was no bitterness in it, just a quiet acceptance that made everything worse somehow. "Will you tell me," Elizabeth asked, "how you learned to play like that?" Margaret was quiet for a long time. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, counting the seconds. Finally, she began to speak. "I grew up in Shanghai. My father was a music teacher, my mother a seamstress. They saved everything they could to buy a piano, a tiny upright that barely fit in our apartment. I was 4 years old when I first touched the keys." Her voice was soft, almost dreamy, like she was watching it all happen again in her mind. I could hear music in everything. The rain on the windows, the street vendors calling out their prices, the way my mother's scissors snipped through fabric. My father said I had a gift. By the time I was 7, I was studying at the Shanghai Conservatory. They called me a prodigy. Elizabeth leaned forward. "What happened?" "The war." Two simple words that carried so much weight. Everything fell apart. The Japanese first, then the Civil War. My father disappeared one night. They came for teachers, for educated people. My mother and I fled with nothing but the clothes we wore. We walked for weeks, trying to reach the coast. Margaret's hands, which had been resting in her lap, tightened slightly. My mother got sick on the ship to America. She died 3 days before we landed in San Francisco. I was 14 years old, alone in a country where I barely spoke the language. No papers, no family, no money. Just memories and hands that knew how to play piano. But surely someone could have helped? The conservatory, or music teachers here. Could have helped the Chinese refugee girl with no documents? No proof of who I was? Margaret shook her head. I was lucky to find work at all. A church took me in, gave me cleaning jobs. I learned to be invisible. Miss Elizabeth. It was safer that way. Elizabeth felt tears on her cheeks. She wiped them away, embarrassed. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry. I survived. That's more than many people can say. Margaret stood up from the piano bench. But this is why I play at night. This piano is the closest thing I have to home, to who I used to be. Just for a few hours, I can remember what it felt like to be that girl in Shanghai, the one everyone said had a future. But you still have a future. You could perform, teach, do something with your gift. With what credentials? What proof? I'm 32 years old, Miss Elizabeth. In music, that's ancient. And I'm a Chinese woman in America. Do you know how many doors that closes? She said it gently, not accusing. Just stating facts. I play for myself now. That's enough. But Elizabeth could see it wasn't enough. Not really. The way Margaret looked at the piano, the hunger in her playing, the careful way she'd said, "That's enough." Like she was trying to convince herself. The next morning at breakfast, James was complaining about something. He always was. This time, it was about the noise. I swear I heard music last night. That old radio in the library must be acting up again. Had me half awake all night. Their mother looked up from her newspaper. I didn't hear anything. Well, I did. Some classical nonsense. Someone should check that radio. Elizabeth kept her eyes on her plate, cutting her eggs into smaller and smaller pieces. She thought about saying something, about defending Margaret, or explaining what she'd witnessed. But Margaret's words echoed in her head. I would have lost my position, so she stayed quiet. But her mind was racing. Over the next week, Elizabeth found excuses to be around the ballroom. She'd bring a book and sit reading, watching Margaret work. The caretaker dusted and cleaned with the same quiet efficiency as always, never giving any sign that she was anything more than what she appeared to be. But Elizabeth knew now, she'd seen the truth. And watching her brother play the piano now, showing off for his friends with his clumsy technique and his careless attitude, made her almost sick with anger. One afternoon, she found Margaret polishing silver in the dining room. I want to help you, Elizabeth said abruptly. Margaret looked up, confused. Help me with the silver? That's kind of you, Miss Elizabeth. But, no. I want to help you with the piano. With your music. There has to be a way. Margaret set down the cloth she was holding. Miss Elizabeth, please. Don't make this harder than it is. My brother humiliated you. He mocked something precious to you without even knowing what he was doing. That's not right. Your brother is young and foolish. That's not a crime. Maybe not. But someone should show him that there's more to people than what they appear to be. That the caretaker he dismissed so easily has more talent in one finger than he has in his entire body. For the first time, Margaret smiled. A real smile. Not the polite one she used for the family. And how would we do that? Elizabeth's eyes lit up. I have an idea. But you'd have to trust me. And you'd have to be brave. Margaret looked at the silver, at her reflection distorted in its polished surface. She thought about the piano sitting silent in the ballroom, about Shanghai and music, and the girl she used to be, about all the years she'd spent being invisible. Tell me your idea, she said finally. And Elizabeth did. Elizabeth spent the next 2 weeks planning everything down to the smallest detail. She told her mother she wanted to host a small evening gathering. Something cultural and sophisticated. Her mother, delighted that her daughter was finally showing interest in society events, agreed immediately. Nothing too large, Elizabeth said carefully. Just an intimate concert. I've heard about this remarkable pianist. Quite mysterious. I thought it would be lovely. A pianist? How wonderful. Your father would have loved that. Her mother's eyes went distant for a moment. Remembering. Who is this performer? Mother now. Who is this performer? Mother now. Aparting the former, someone extraordinary. That's all I can say for now. It's meant to be a surprise. Her mother laughed, charmed by the secrecy. Well, all right then. Make your arrangements. I'll invite the Hendersons and the Wainwrights. Oh, and the Ashfords. They appreciate good music. Elizabeth's stomach twisted with nerves. But she kept her face calm. Perfect. And James should be there too. Of course. Naturally. Though getting your brother to sit through a concert will take some doing. That was exactly what Elizabeth was counting on. Margaret, meanwhile, was terrified. Every time she thought about what they were planning, her hands started shaking. She'd spent 18 years being invisible, and now Elizabeth wanted her to step into the spotlight in front of the very people who saw her as nothing more than furniture. I can't do this, she told Elizabeth one afternoon when they were alone in the library. What if they laugh? What if your mother fires me on the spot? They won't laugh. Not once you start playing. Elizabeth gripped her hands. Margaret, you're brilliant. But no one will ever know that, unless you show them. Don't you want them to see you? Really see you? Margaret pulled her hands away, pacing to the window. Outside, the gardener was trimming the hedges. Another invisible person, just doing their job. I stopped wanting to be seen years ago, Miss Elizabeth. It was easier that way. Easier isn't the same as better. Maybe not. But it's safer. Elizabeth came to stand beside her. My father used to say that the most important things we do are always the scary ones. The things that make our hands shake and our hearts race. Those are the moments that matter. Your father was a brave man. So are you. You crossed an ocean alone at 14. You survived when you had every reason to give up. Playing piano for some stuffy society people should be easy compared to that. Margaret laughed, but it was a nervous sound. When you put it that way. So you'll do it? There was a long pause. Margaret watched the gardener work. Methodical and invisible. Then she thought about the piano in the ballroom, about Shanghai, about her father's hands guiding hers across the keys when she was small, about the music that lived inside her, always pushing to get out. I'll do it, she whispered. God help me. I'll do it. The night of the concert arrived too quickly. Margaret had barely slept for 3 days. She'd been practicing late into the night, her fingers moving through pieces she hadn't played in years. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. But it was also the piece her father had loved most, the one he'd been teaching her before everything fell apart. Elizabeth had arranged everything. The ballroom was lit with candles, chairs set up in neat rows. About 20 guests were expected. All people who supposedly appreciated fine music. The story was simple. Elizabeth had discovered a mysterious virtuoso and arranged a private performance. No one knew who the pianist would be. Margaret stood in the kitchen, wearing her usual plain dress. Her hands felt cold despite the warm evening. She could hear the guests arriving, their voices floating through the house. Laughter, conversation, the clink of glasses. You don't have to go through with this, Elizabeth said, appearing in the doorway. She looked beautiful in a blue evening gown, her hair pinned up elegantly. If it's too much, we can say the pianist took ill. No. Margaret's voice was steadier than she felt. I need to do this. For myself, if for no one else. You look perfect just as you are. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Margaret nodded, though her heart was hammering. She followed Elizabeth through the hallway, staying in the shadows until the last moment. Through the doorway, she could see the assembled guests. Mrs. Thornwood sitting in the front row, smiling and gracious. The Hendersons, the Wainwrights, other familiar faces, people she'd served tea to, cleaned up after, made herself invisible for, and there was James, slouched in his chair with a drink in his hand, looking supremely bored. He'd complained about having to attend, Elizabeth had told her. He'd rather be out with his friends at some bar in Hartford. Elizabeth stepped into the ballroom, and the conversations quieted. Thank you all for coming tonight. I know you're curious about our performer. I promise you, what you're about to hear is truly exceptional. This musician has trained at one of the finest conservatories in the world and possesses a gift that words cannot adequately describe. James rolled his eyes. Margaret saw it from where she stood in the hallway, and something hardened in her chest. Good. Let him be dismissive. Let him be unprepared. Without further delay, Elizabeth continued, I present to you this evening's pianist. She gestured toward the doorway. This was it. The moment. Margaret's legs felt like water, but she forced them to move. One step, then another. She walked into the ballroom, into the light. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, confused murmurs. Mrs. Thornwood's hand flew to her chest. Several guests leaned forward in their chairs, certain they must be mistaken about what they were seeing. James actually sat up straight, his drink forgotten. No joke, James. Please, give Margaret a chance. That's all I ask. Margaret? He looked genuinely bewildered. Our Margaret? Margaret walked to the piano, her face burning but her steps steady. She'd come this far. She wouldn't turn back now. She sat down on the bench, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees for a moment as she gathered herself. The room was completely silent. The kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy with judgment and disbelief. She could feel every eye on her, could sense the skepticism radiating from the audience. She closed her eyes and thought about her father, about Shanghai, about the girl she'd been before the world taught her to make herself small. Then she placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's concerto filled the room. Powerful, deliberate, building. Her fingers found their way across the keys like they were coming home. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of dust and silence. But perfect and true. The music swelled. It spoke of longing and loss, of beauty and pain, of everything Margaret had survived, and everything she'd had to leave behind. Her hands moved with absolute certainty now, pulling from the piano sounds that seemed impossible. The melody rose and fell, complex passages that required years of training to execute, emotion that couldn't be faked or learned. She opened her eyes briefly and saw the audience transformed. Mrs. Thornwood's mouth was open in shock. The Hendersons were leaning forward, transfixed. Several women had tears streaming down their faces. And James sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, his earlier smugness completely gone. He looked like someone had just shown him something he couldn't comprehend, something that shattered everything he thought he knew about the world. Margaret closed her eyes again and surrendered to the music. This was who she was. Not the invisible caretaker. Not the refugee who'd learned to stay quiet. This was Margaret Chen, pianist, the girl her father had called gifted, the student the conservatory had celebrated. She'd been buried, but she'd never been gone. The concerto built to its powerful crescendo. Her hands flew across the keys, pulling out every ounce of emotion, every memory, every year of silence. The room seemed to vibrate with the sound. It was more than music. It was resurrection. And then, the final notes. Soft, gentle, fading into silence like a whisper. Margaret's hands lifted from the keys. She sat completely still, breathing hard, feeling more alive than she had in 18 years. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 3, then the applause began. Not polite, restrained clapping, real applause. Thunder. Several people stood up, then more, until the entire room was on its feet. The Wainwrights were openly crying. Mrs. Henderson was clutching her husband's arm, saying, "Extraordinary," over and over. Mrs. Thornwood stood slowly, her face a mixture of shock and something that might have been shame. She began to clap too, her hands moving mechanically. Margaret stood and turned to face them. She didn't bow, didn't smile. She simply looked at them. At all these people who'd never really seen her before, letting them finally, truly see her now. And then she looked at James. He was still sitting, the only person not standing. But his face had changed. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something raw and honest. He looked devastated. The guests didn't leave for hours. They crowded around Margaret, asking questions, offering praise, treating her like she was someone important. It was dizzying and strange. These were the same people who'd walked past her 1,000 times without a second glance. Mrs. Henderson gripped Margaret's hand. "My dear, that was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. Where did you train? How long have you been playing?" "The Shanghai Conservatory, ma'am. I started when I was 4. "Shanghai," Mr. Wainwright exclaimed. "That's quite a journey from there to here. You must tell us your story." "Sondam." 9. Mr. Wainwright. "Sondam." Mr. Wainwright. But Margaret wasn't ready to tell them everything. Not yet. Some parts of her past were still too raw, too private to share with people who hours ago hadn't known she existed as anything more than a servant. "It's a long story," she said simply. "Perhaps another time." Elizabeth rescued her, guiding her away from the crowd. "You were magnificent," she whispered. "Even better than I imagined. I was terrified. I know. That's what made it brave." Across the room, James finally stood up. He moved, like someone in a daze, walking out of the ballroom without a word to anyone. Margaret watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and something else. Something that felt almost like pity. Mrs. Thornwood approached them, her expression complicated. "Margaret, I don't know what to say. I had no idea." "No one did, ma'am. That was the point." "But why? Why didn't you tell us? We could have helped, could have done something." Margaret smiled, but it was a tired smile. "With respect, Mrs. Thornwood, I'm not sure you would have believed me if I'd told you. Some things need to be heard to be believed." The older woman flushed slightly, knowing it was true. "Well, regardless, this changes things, doesn't it?" "Does it?" Margaret asked quietly. That question hung in the air as the guests finally began to leave. They all promised to tell their friends, to spread the word about the remarkable discovery they'd witnessed. Margaret accepted their praise and their business cards, their invitations to perform at other gatherings. But she felt oddly empty. After everyone was gone, Margaret helped clean up. Old habits. Elizabeth tried to stop her, but she needed to do something with her hands. "You don't have to do that anymore," Elizabeth said. "Not after tonight. I still work here, Miss Elizabeth. That hasn't changed. But it should change. You can't go back to dusting and serving after what happened tonight. Those people saw what you can do." 3. Margaret picked up empty glasses, stacking them on a tray. Those people saw a performance. A novelty. The Chinese caretaker, who can play piano. Tomorrow morning, they'll wake up and remember I'm still Chinese, still a refugee with no papers, still someone without a proper place in their world. You don't know that, don't I? Margaret paused, looking around the empty ballroom. "I've lived in this country for 18 years, Miss Elizabeth. I know how it works." But over the next few days, something unexpected happened. Word spread quickly through Hartford's social circles. The mysterious pianist. The hidden genius, working as a caretaker. People loved a good story. And this was a remarkable one. Letters began arriving at the Thornwood house. Invitations for Margaret to play at other events. Inquiries from music teachers, wanting to know about her background. Even a letter from a professor at the Hartford Conservatory, asking if she'd be interested in teaching. Mrs. Thornwood didn't know what to do with it all. She called Margaret into the sitting room one afternoon. The pile of letters spread across her desk. "This is highly unusual," she said, clearly uncomfortable. I'm not sure how to proceed. You're still in my employment, but these people are requesting your services as a musician. I understand it's complicated, ma'am. Complicated? Mrs. Thornwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. My friends are asking me how I discovered you. As if you were some exotic treasure I'd been hiding away. It's all very awkward. Margaret said nothing. She'd learned when to speak and when to stay quiet. There's a letter here from the Hartford Symphony. Mrs. Thornwood continued, holding up an envelope. They want you to audition for a paid position. Margaret's heart jumped. Yes, Mr. Wainwright is on the board, apparently. He was quite taken with your performance. She set the letter down. I suppose you'll want to pursue this. I would like to, yes. And what about your position here? It was a fair question. Margaret thought about the past 18 years. The invisible life she'd built. The safety of knowing exactly where she stood, even if that place was small and limited. I don't know, ma'am. I suppose that depends on whether the audition goes well. Mrs. Thornwood nodded slowly. Well, I suppose we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. James had been avoiding everyone since the concert. He spent his days out, coming home late, saying little. Elizabeth finally cornered him in the library, 3 days later. You need to talk to her, she said without preamble. Talk to who? James didn't look up from the book he wasn't really reading. Don't play dumb, Margaret. You need to apologize. I didn't do anything. Really? You don't remember? Play that piano, and I'll marry you. Laughing at her in front of all those people, James closed the book. That was weeks ago. And how was I supposed to know she could actually play? That's exactly the point, James. You didn't know anything about her, but you felt entitled to mock her anyway. You treated her like she was nothing. I didn't mean it like that, but that's how it was. And now you can't even face her, because you're embarrassed. Well, you should be embarrassed. You should be ashamed. James stood up, agitated. What do you want me to say, Elizabeth? That I was wrong? Fine, I was wrong. That I'm an idiot? I am. Is that what you want to hear? I don't need to hear it. Margaret does. She doesn't want to hear from me. Trust me. How would you know? You've been hiding in here for 3 days. Elizabeth softened her voice. Look, I know this is uncomfortable, but running away doesn't make it better. It just makes you a coward on top of everything else. James flinched. That's harsh. It's true. And you know it. He was quiet for a long moment. What she did that night. That performance. I've never seen anything like it. I know. She's been here for 3 years. 3 years. And I never once thought of her as a real person. Someone with a history. With talent. With dreams. She was just the caretaker. He looked at his sister. What does that say about me? It says you're young and thoughtless and privileged. But those things can change if you want them to. Can they? I think so. But you have to try. That evening, James finally gathered his courage. He found Margaret in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for dinner. She looked up when he entered. Her expression carefully neutral. Mr. James, can I help you with something? I wanted to talk to you, if you have a moment. She set down the knife she was holding. All right. He stood there awkwardly, hands in his pockets. All the words he'd practiced suddenly felt inadequate. I owe you an apology. For what I said at the party. The way I treated you. It was cruel and thoughtless, and you didn't deserve it. Margaret studied him. No, I didn't. I've been thinking a lot about that night. About how I've treated you. How I've treated everyone who works here. Really. Like you're not real people. Like you only exist to serve us. That's how most people in your position think, Mr. James. That doesn't make it right. He pulled out a chair and sat down, uninvited. Can I ask you something? That night, when I made that stupid joke, you looked at me in a way I can't stop thinking about. Like you knew something I didn't. Margaret leaned against the counter. I knew that you had no idea who you were talking to, what I'd given up, what I'd survived. You saw a caretaker. I saw a boy who'd never had to struggle for anything in his life. The words stung, but James nodded. I've never had to fight for anything. Is there a point to this conversation, Mr. James? I guess I'm trying to say that watching you play that night, it changed something in me. I realized how much I don't know, how much I've taken for granted, how many people I've dismissed without ever really seeing them. Margaret was quiet for a moment. That's a valuable realization. What are you going to do with it? I don't know yet. But I'm trying to figure it out. He stood up. I heard about the symphony audition. Elizabeth told me. Yes. It's in 3 days. Are you nervous? Terrified? You shouldn't be. You're extraordinary. They'd be lucky to have you. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I meant what I said that day. If I'd known you could play like that, I would have proposed on the spot. Margaret actually laughed. No, you wouldn't have. You're right. I wouldn't have. But I would have been honored to hear you play. And I am now. Even though I don't deserve to be. After he left, Margaret stood in the kitchen for a long time, thinking. The apology had been genuine, she could tell that much. But words were easy. Changing who you were deep down, that was harder. She wondered if James had it in him. 3 days later, she stood outside the Hartford Symphony Hall, holding the audition letter in her hand. Her fingers were trembling slightly. Elizabeth had wanted to come for support, but Margaret had asked to go alone. This was something she needed to do by herself. Not as the Thornwoods' caretaker, not as anyone's employee or servant. Just as Margaret Chen, pianist. She walked through the doors, into whatever came next. The audition room was smaller than Margaret expected. Just a piano, a few chairs, and 3 people sitting behind a table with stern expressions. The kind of room where dreams either came true or died quietly. Miss Chen, one of them, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his papers. Please, whenever you're ready. Margaret sat at the piano, her heart pounding so hard she was certain they could hear it. This was different from the performance at the Thornwood house. That had been about proving something, about revealing herself. This was about her future, about whether she could step back into the life she'd lost so many years ago. She closed her eyes and let her hands find the keys. She played Debussy this time, something softer and more introspective. The notes floated through the small room like water, gentle and sure. She poured everything into it. All the years of silence, all the nights playing alone in the dark, all the hope she'd kept buried because hope was too dangerous. When she finished, there was silence. Then, the woman on the panel leaned forward. Where did you say you trained? Shanghai Conservatory, ma'am. Before the war. And you've been in Hartford for how long? 18 years. The panel members exchanged glances. Margaret could see the unspoken questions in their eyes. 18 years? And they were only hearing about her now? What had she been doing all that time? Miss Chen, the older man said carefully, your technique is exceptional, truly remarkable. But I have to ask, why are you only auditioning now? At your age, most professional pianists have already established their careers. There it was. The question she'd been dreading. Margaret took a breath. I've been surviving, sir. When you come to a country with nothing, no papers, no family, no money, you do what you must to stay alive. Music was a luxury I couldn't afford. Until recently, I didn't think I could afford it again. The woman's expression softened slightly. That must have been very difficult. It was, but I never stopped playing. Not in my heart. They asked her to play another piece. Then another. By the time she left the audition, 2 hours had passed. They told her they'd be in touch within a week. She walked out into the afternoon sunshine, feeling wrung out and strangely light, like she'd set down something heavy she'd been carrying for years. Back at the Thornwood house, Life continued in its usual rhythm. But everything felt different now. The other staff members looked at Margaret with new eyes, some with respect, some with envy, some with confusion. She was still doing her regular work, but everyone knew it might not last. "What will you do if you get the position?" Helen, the cook, asked one morning. She'd worked at the house for 15 years and had always been kind to Margaret. "I suppose I'll have to leave here. The symphony rehearses during the day. Will you miss it? This place?" Margaret looked around the kitchen. She'd spent countless hours here, preparing meals, cleaning up, staying invisible. "I'll miss the people. You, Elizabeth, even Mrs. Thornwood in her way. But the work itself? No, I won't miss that. Can't say I blame you. If I could play piano like that, I'd be gone in a heartbeat." Helen smiled. "Though, I'd miss having you around. You're the only one here who listens to my stories." The letter came 5 days later. Margaret was dusting the library when Mrs. Thornwood brought it in. The envelope still sealed. "Thanks for watching. And to the 41, this arrived for you. From the symphony. Vively. From Vively." Margaret's hands froze. She set down her dustcloth and took the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. "Well?" Mrs. Thornwood said after a moment. "Aren't you going to open it?" Margaret tore open the envelope and pulled out the letter. Her eyes scanned the words once, then again, to make sure she'd read them correctly. "They want me," she whispered. "They're offering me a position. Not full orchestra. Not yet. But as an occasional soloist and backup pianist. Paid position." Mrs. Thornwood sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs. "I see. I'll need to give you notice, of course. I'll stay as long as you need to find a replacement. Don't be ridiculous. You should leave as soon as possible. This is a real opportunity for you." The older woman's voice was stiff, formal. "I'm happy for you, Margaret, truly. Even if it is rather inconvenient timing. Thank you, ma'am, for everything. You gave me a place when I had nowhere else to go. Yes, well, we certainly got our money's worth over the years. Didn't we?" Mrs. Thornwood stood up. "I'll speak to the agency about finding someone new. You can stay through the end of the month if you need time to make arrangements." After she left, Margaret sank into the chair, staring at the letter. It was real. It was actually happening. She was going to play piano again, professionally, the way she'd always dreamed, the way her father had dreamed for her. Elizabeth found her there an hour later, still sitting with the letter in her hands. "You got it, didn't you? I can see it on your face." Margaret looked up, and Elizabeth saw tears streaming down her cheeks. Happy tears, sad tears, overwhelmed tears. Everything at once. "I got it." Elizabeth pulled her into a fierce hug, propriety forgotten. "I'm so proud of you. So incredibly proud." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Margaret found a small room to rent near the symphony hall. It was tiny, barely bigger than the closet she'd lived in when she first arrived in America. But it was hers. She bought a second-hand piano, nothing fancy, but good enough to practice on. Her first performance with the symphony was nerve-wracking. Playing for 20 people in a ballroom was one thing. Playing for hundreds in a concert hall was something else entirely. But when she walked onto that stage and sat at the grand piano, something settled inside her. This was where she belonged. This was who she was meant to be. The reviews in the Hartford paper were glowing. "A remarkable discovery," one critic wrote. "Margaret Chen plays with a depth of emotion that can only come from truly lived experience." James came to that first performance. Margaret spotted him in the audience, sitting in the back row like he didn't want to be noticed. After the concert, he waited by the stage door. "You were incredible," he said simply. "Thank you. I meant what I said before, about that stupid joke I made. If I could take it back. But you can't, Margaret interrupted gently. None of us can take back the things we've said or done. We can only decide who we want to be moving forward. James nodded slowly. You know what the strange thing is? That joke, as awful as it was, it led to all this. To you, playing again. To everyone seeing what you can do. Yes. I've thought about that too. Margaret adjusted the coat she was carrying. Sometimes cruelty opens doors we were too afraid to open ourselves. You forced me to stop hiding. I'm not sure I would have done it otherwise. So, I accidentally did you a favor by being a complete ass? I wouldn't go that far. She smiled. But maybe something good can come from something bad. If we let it. 7. Rain. She smiled. Are you happy? James asked suddenly. Now. I mean. With the symphony? And everything? Margaret thought about the question. Was she happy? She was exhausted. Constantly nervous. Still struggling to pay her rent. The symphony position didn't pay much, and she had to take on private students to make ends meet. Her fingers ached from practicing, and sometimes she still woke up terrified that it was all a dream. I'm alive, she said finally. Really alive, for the first time in 18 years. That's better than happy. Over the following months, Margaret's reputation grew. She performed regularly with the symphony, started teaching at the Hartford Conservatory, and took on talented students who reminded her of herself at that age. Word spread about her story, the refugee caretaker who'd hidden her genius for nearly 2 decades. People sometimes asked if she was bitter about the lost years. She always said no, though it wasn't entirely true. But bitterness, she'd learned, was a luxury she couldn't afford. It took up too much space in your heart. Space better used for music and hope and moving forward. Elizabeth visited often, staying friends even though their roles had changed. They'd have tea and talk about books and music and life. Margaret was grateful for her, for taking that risk, for seeing her when no one else did. As for James, he surprised everyone by going back to school. Not Yale this time, but a teaching program. He wanted to work with immigrants. He said, help people who were struggling to find their place in a new country. His mother thought he'd lost his mind. Elizabeth thought it was the first sensible thing he'd ever done. One evening, almost a year after that fateful garden party, Margaret gave a solo recital at the Symphony Hall. The place was packed. She stood backstage, listening to the murmur of the crowd, and thought about her father, about Shanghai, about the girl she'd been, and the woman she'd become. She thought about that moment in the Thornwood ballroom when James had laughed and said, "Play that piano, and I'll marry you." He'd meant it as mockery, as a joke at her expense, but in a strange way, it had been a promise. Not the one he'd intended, but a promise nonetheless. A promise that if she played, if she revealed herself, if she stopped hiding, something would change. And it had. Everything had changed. She walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, sat at the piano, and began to play. Not for James, not for the Thornwoods, not even for the audience. She played for herself, for her father, for every person who'd ever had to hide who they were to survive. She played for the caretaker who dusted that piano every day, dreaming of the moment when she could finally, truly, be seen. And she played for the future, whatever it might bring.